Here we go. Good afternoon, community. I'm the Reverend Charisma Jean Marie, and I serve as the Director for Racial Justice Ministries at Scarrett Bennett Center here in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us again for another live conversation. These next 2 weeks, we will be engaging the topic, racism, a multicultural conversation. And I believe it's a very important conversation to have. I thought it was an important conversation to host because at Scarrett Bennett Center, as we engage this work, we're mindful how important it is to be inclusive of all. Storytelling is our model and how we do this work. And we believe it's a powerful tool that we use because this model helps us to hear the experiences of people who we might not have the opportunity to engage in our own worlds. My observation and my experience in engaging racism in the public sector has been one that limits the experiences and stories to two particular groups. Conversations about racism as a whole in the public sector can give an illusion that the world is only made up of white and Black people. And the Black people are monolithic, right? That there's a monolith, the Black people are monolithic, there's just one type of Black people in the world, when that is not the case. That is not true. Oftentimes, when we talk about the lived experiences of Black people in America, what we're really talking about is the African American experience. And if I can be honest, we're often really talking about the African American male experience, if we're going to be honest. But like I said earlier, Black is a very diverse terminology. But oftentimes, we don't hear these other Black stories and experiences. We rarely hear or include the experiences of people from the African diaspora, people like Haitians and Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans and Trinidadians. We don't really often hear their stories. We don't often hear their voices in the public sector as we talk about, we engage racism in this country. Now, I'll be honest, we also don't hear the experiences of other minorities as it relates to racism. The Asian community, we don't often hear about the indigenous community when we talk about this conversation around racism. America is not only made up of white and Black people. America is America because of the immigrants. America is America because of immigrant people. The American story is not complete without the immigrant story. And that's what this conversation is. This conversation really is about including the voices, the stories of people who are often left out when we're talking about racism in this country. So again, I welcome you to this conversation. I'm so glad you're here. I am excited about our panelists who are here, who will come and share their stories and help us expand our understanding and even our knowledge of people in this country who come from various different backgrounds and cultures who also have a part in this story. As always, this is sacred space. And as you join us, we welcome you. Matter of fact, we encourage you to join us in this conversation. So you're welcome to add your thoughts and your questions in the comment sections of this live post. And difference is accepted, is appreciated in this space. So difference of opinions and perspectives are always appreciated in this space. But difference does not mean disrespect or hate. And so any comments or questions that reflect disrespectful or hate, we will delete it immediately. For this is sacred space. And here at Scarrett Bennett Center, our way is radical hospitality. And so while our guest is under our care, we believe that it is our responsibility to take care of them the best that we could, and we will do that. So again, thank you for joining us in this conversation here today. Let me introduce to you my beloved sister-in-law, who I'm so grateful for her work, her witness, her prophetic work that she does there in Texas, and her yes to this invitation to come and moderate this important conversation. Dearla Premalon is with us. Thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having us and for elevating the importance of this conversation. It's a conversation that I frequently have because of my social position in society as a Black woman from the Caribbean, and so from Haiti specifically. And so I love that we are elevating this conversation. We are having this conversation, and you created space for this conversation. For me, as a frame this conversation this afternoon, I want to use the words of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I know I'm messing up her words. She's a Nigerian thinker and writer and speaker who had a TED Talk series or show talking about the dangers of a single story. And for me, you know, as we're having this conversation and as you're elevating or zooming into all of our stories, you know, it brought me back to her TED Talk that we don't just have one story. There are multiple stories. And even within our stories, there are many layers of our stories. And so I wanted to remind us of that there's not just one story, there are many stories. My story began in Haiti. I was born in Haiti. My parents had three daughters at that time when I was born. And my parents, you know, living in Haiti, and if you know the context of Haiti, you know, extreme poverty and lack of opportunities and all that, everyone in Haiti want to leave Haiti for a better life. You know, I'll get the question, why did your parents leave Haiti? Or what brought them to America? When you live in a context like Haiti, especially have daughters, there's almost no other choice but to leave your context in order to provide a better life for your children, for your daughters. And that's what they did. I was just a few months old when they left me with my grandmother and with my aunt. And they left for 10 years. I did not meet my parents until I was about 11. And at that time, they had made their way to St. Martin and some of the other islands in the Caribbean, and then eventually found their way to America. And that journey took them 10 years because of the immigration laws at that time. They were not able to bring all of us with them. And so in 86, I met my parents for the first time. I was 11. And at the age of 12, I found myself in America as a 1.5 generation immigrant, which is a number they give us as opposed to first generation or second generation. We're right in the middle. Because there's fluidity. For those of us who are 1.5ers, we know enough about our culture and our context in Haiti. And then we know enough about the American context because our adolescence was lived in both our country of origin and our new country, which is America for me. And so that, for me, that the 1.5 generation title, you know, for me, it just brings on a lot of tension, identity issues, because I'm not fully Haitian in Haiti and I'm not fully American in America. I'm both, you know? And so navigating through both of those has been a tension point for me. And I think healing has come out of what we're doing here. It's elevating the stories. It's talking about the stories. I remember the first time I learned that my story wasn't unique was when I moved to Texas and I met my first Indian family. We were living in the apartment complex and we were sharing stories like we're about to do today. And she was telling me about how she got to America. And I almost fell out my seat because I'm like, you too? So it was like the Me Too movement for immigrants, you know, when we come to realize that I wasn't the only one. My story wasn't just unique, that her parents left her too. Her parents left to find a better life too. And that, you know, they were able to send for her, and that my story wasn't the most unique story. I love that we have a Haitian, me, on this panel representing the Caribbean, because I'm sure all of you on the panel today, you are all aware of a little bit of the Haitian history, you know, from slavery, being enslaved and colonized by the French, and Haiti being the first country to successfully defeat slavery, to defeat slave masters. And we were at one point the most richest colonies, and where everyone wanted a piece of Haiti, but we had the only successful slave revolt. The other thing I think many people don't know about Haiti is that because we were the first nation that successfully defeated slavery, we played a role in many other countries being liberated as well. For example, you know, Simon Bolivar from Venezuela. You know, he had a meeting with our emperor at that time, Pétion, Alexander Pétion. I don't know how to say his name in English, but Bolivar got smite by the French army, and I'm going to make this short. And he came to Haiti for support by our emperor at that time, Pétion, and to ask for support. And Pétion, he said, the only way I will support you is if when you win independence, and when you defeat the Spanish army, that you will liberate, and you will liberate all the enslaved people in these countries. And that's exactly what Simon Bolivar did. He, because of Haiti, and the emperor at that time gave him resources and gave him men to defeat the Spanish army at that time. And because of Haiti, and because at that time we were free, Simone was able to free the west of Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, North Peru, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Bolivia, all of these countries. And I don't know if anyone, if we know and if we are aware that Haiti played a role in that. So I'm very proud of my heritage. I'm proud of the history. I'm proud where I'm from. I'm proud of the different layers that I carry, and the different contexts that I carry with me. And that makes my story not just a unique story, but I love how I can come together with all of our panelists today to just share our stories and share where we're from. So today, I would love to start with my Indian brother, Niji, to share a little bit about his story and his context and where he's coming from, and just the different layers about him that brought him to here today on this panel today.
Thank you so much, Jula. I appreciate that. Glad to be here and excited to be here. I was born in India. We were in the north, and so my dad came here first to find a job and settle, and then he brought the rest of the family to America. At the age of 13 is when I moved to the US, and so it's a significant age because in India you're taught English, you're taught 3 languages, your native tongue, English, as well as Hindi, which is another common language that we are able to communicate. India has about 1,600 dialects, so state to state, everybody speaks a different language, and culture, different food, different outfits. And so there is a variety of, just even within the state, you go up north or south, the language, there's some variations of languages as well as food. We love to eat, we love flavor, we love spicy food. So just being able to get a little bit of that, and so in seeing the variety of that, and that's how India is. It's just a culture mixed in so much and so many variety of it. Just looking at Indian food alone, you go to a buffet, you see the variety of it, and it's a little bit of every different. Some of them are a little bit of different states that represent it. So coming to the state at the age of 13. It was very difficult. It was very challenging. just to, I read and wrote English. However, American English is completely different. So not understanding the culture and not understanding what anybody said. Of course, as soon as we landed here, first thing my parents did is enroll me in school. and, and, and just sitting in a class, I didn't know you're supposed to get up and move around to your class. I just sat in a history class all day until the teacher recognized that I was there from morning. And so just things like that, having to work through all of those and understanding the American culture and how to even work through that. It was very challenging. As a preteen coming here, you had your friends, and so that trying to restart friendships were difficult. And in the school that I went to, from a race perspective, there's only one Indian that was from the North, and that was the only that I could relate to, or at least somewhat connect to. So there was not a assimilation there. However, we went to an Indian church. That's where I got to connect with other Indians and being able to work through the adaptation of American culture. So going through all of those, it was an interesting experience, and I think that even though it was difficult, it helped me firm up. And I love the concept of having both cultures, and it's so powerful because you get to be part of both. You get to be proud of both, and I think that is who I am, and it is unique to me, and I'm proud of that. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited about what the next part is, as well as today. And so that's my story.
I love that. I love how you shared you get to have both cultures and be proud of both and glean from both and embody both. That's just it's beautiful, and that's just where we are. I think one of the things I share often about the immigrant story is that trauma is often what brings us to America. There's so much trauma for me in Haiti. There are so many challenges that we're here in America because of trauma, but we are able to take the traumatic experiences that we've had, and we're able to just bring them and heal from them and create a new culture for us. I think the immigrants are able to create this new thing for ourselves and join into what's happening in the world. So I love that. I'd love to hear some more stories. I think Tasha, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from and your context? Take it away.
Hi, so my name is, so I am known as Tasha M. Chusak. That is my professional name. It is the anglicized pronunciation of my name. But if you ask my dad, if you ask my people, my name is Tasha Miyoshi Chusak. And legend has it that my mother originally named me Yesenia del Carmen Chusak, but my father opted to name me after a telenovela character and a Japanese actress, and that's a story for another time. So I was born in Panama, which is a lovely country smack dab in the middle of Central America. You may have heard of it. There's a handy canal that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And I am the daughter of the children of immigrants to Panama. So, and who later became an immigrant to the United States. So to be precise, my mother's grandmother is from Jamaica. My father's grandmother is from Barbados. And my father's father, so my grandfather, is from Costa Rica by way of Jamaica. So he was born in Costa Rica. His parents were born in Jamaica. His mother was definitely from India. We don't know if she was born in India or if she was born in Jamaica, but definitely Indian. So my parents are about second generation. immigrants to Panama, and then I became an immigrant to the United States at the age of 10. My mother originally came to the United States when I was 5, and she was gone for about 5 years. So I can relate to both Niji's and Diula's story. She was gone for about 5 years, and then she sent for all of us. I am the youngest of 7. My oldest sister came first, and then we all traveled together. I and 5 of my sisters and my first nephew made it to New York City when I was 10. So shout out to Patricia, Griselda, Rosalba, Gabriela, Geraldine, and Tanya, and my nephew Fabio, affectionately known as Patsy, Chelly, Rosy, Gabi, Tanya, and Dina.
I love it.
I am a descendant of, so in Panama, there's 2 distinct groups of African descendants. There are the Afro-colonials, who are descendants of enslaved people who were brought by the Spaniards. And then there are the Afro-Antillians, who are the descendants of the laborers who built the Panama Canal. So I am a descendant of the latter. I grew up in a bilingual home. I grew up in an Afro-Caribbean home steeped in Caribbean culture. So, but I'm also a Latina. I grew up in a Central American country, so I can get with the soca and the reggae and the merengue and the salsa and the arroz con pollo and the rice and peas and the oxtail and the pozole. Like, I can get with all of it. I can dance some compas too.
Woo,
So,
okay. Did you just say compa?
Yes, there's a Haitian
right.
population in Panama. So, we
Nice.
had the, we had all of it. So, so that was my experience coming to the United States. I didn't have my experience was different in that I didn't have a severe language barrier. I could speak, write, and read English when I came. I was in the 5th grade. I was placed well in school, and so that wasn't a challenge. But again, I think just finding your identity when you move around. The identity was already complex enough. Coming to the United States, I think in a previous conversation, Jose brilliantly noted that in the United States, it tends to be about how your proximity to either whiteness or blackness. And so though, you check the box, and so you get categorized as, I'm a Latina, they make you choose Latina, non-Black. But I didn't fit in. In 5th grade, the majority of the Latinos in my community in 5th grade were Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, and I just didn't fit in. But so I fit in with the Caribbean population. So the Jamaicans and the Trinidadians and the Bajan people, they became my community. I grew up in Brooklyn, Crown Heights community in Brooklyn. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, all 10 of us. But my experience, there's one distinct difference that I do want to highlight, and that is for me personally, for us, my mother's coming to the United States was an act of emancipation from patriarchy and misogyny, but not economic emancipation, because we were firm middle class in Panama. We were not economically disadvantaged. I did not know poverty until I came to the United States, which made adjusting to the United States a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And a bit resentful. I was a little resentful about that experience. So that's interesting. And it's interesting to navigate the assumptions that people make. Everybody assumes that if you immigrate to the United States, it must be because you were suffering poverty and oppression somewhere. But there are lots of immigrants who were professionals and had, a better economic people. Just basically, we immigrate here for lots of different reasons, and it's not always, economic oppression. So I'll leave it at that for now. I think that there's probably a ton more that I can say, but there are other people on this panel.
Yes. Thank you, Tasha, for sharing, some of what you shared, as far as identity, wrestling with identity. I think many of us on this panel will find as a common theme or a common thread for all of us. And then you talk about how in America it blends our stories into this one, or you're having to pick from the few census boxes that they give us, right? I've always heard that, America is the melting pot. When I was growing up, I thought, that the melting pot was a good thing, that America has this melting pot. But as I got older and started reading and studying more, I'm like, wait a minute. But that means I'm no longer culturally Haitian, you're no longer with all of your layers. It blends all of us into this big blob in this soup, this blended soup together. Someone used the analogy of a salad, where, let's think of us as a salad. You can clearly see the lettuce, you can clearly see the tomatoes, you can clearly see the different parts of the salad that makes a salad. So for me, I love the thought of us not just being a melting pot or this big, pureed soup, but something that's meaty that you can eat. It's like good sustenance, good food that we all can be nourished by. So each of our cultures can nourish and makes America what it is today. So thank you for sharing, Tasha. Let's see who's next. Gerald, why don't you tell us a little bit about your context and where you're coming from in your story?
Thank you, Deola. And it's been amazing to hear everybody's stories so far. So I'm Gerald. I teach at Princeton Seminary and am also a United Methodist minister. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, actually, and Tasha's story about her name made me think about how my name was given. I'm named after Gerald Ford for some reason, the only president not elected to office at the vice presidency or the presidency, so maybe I'll have that luck. But I also have a given Chinese name, Liu Ziping, which means balance. And if you look at my birth certificate, it's just Gerald, Liu Ziping, Chen, Liu. It's like all the names just kind of in one long line because they didn't have spaces for two different names. We ended up in Jackson because that was where my dad's first teaching job was. So my first language is actually English. I'm not an immigrant, but my parents are immigrants from Taiwan. My mother was born in China and moved to Taiwan during the Cultural Revolution in the 40s. And then my father was born and raised in Taiwan, but they met in Kirksville, Missouri in 1967. I'm the youngest of three boys. My oldest brother was born in Ames, Iowa, where my dad ended up doing his PhD. But the reason why 67 is an important year for East Asian immigration and immigration in general is in 1882, the US passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first immigration ban. And it essentially wasn't repealed fully until 1965 when all quotas were lifted. There were a few acts like the Magnuson Act in 43, and then the Hart-Celler Act came in 65. And I think there was one intervening one in 52, also one in 24, and then 1892 was an extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Anyway, you had this immigration ban for almost 100 years, over 80 years. And then you had a flood of East Asians coming post-65. That's when my parents came. And part of the reason for this was not just a lifting of quotas. The Department of Defense wanted to kind of skim white-collar workers from East Asian countries to work for the Department of Defense. That's why you got a lot of educated Asians coming over. They wanted engineers. My dad ended up in the humanities, and his first job was at Jackson State University, which is a historically Black college and university founded by the, I think it's the American Baptist Home Mission Society of New York. They founded this HBCU in Jackson, and he stayed there his whole career. And so that's how I ended up in the South. Interestingly, you know, we were a family of five and we were almost 1%ers, meaning that Jackson was 71% Black, 27% white, and less than 1% Asian. So Latino, Native American, and mixed race people, they made about 2% of the population. now Clinton, the suburb that I grew up in, is 53% white and 37% black. But for me, it felt 50-50 most of the time between black and white races. And I quickly had to learn how to navigate that as soon as I could understand what was going on. I mean, I was called Chink and asked where was I from and whether I knew karate, and jeered with choi oi oi as long as I could understand the English language. And it was coming from both sides. So this was quite a cultural education that has come in handy. But because of that, I think I felt very compelled to, in my own work and my involvement with Christian ministry, to think about how to break open the black and white binary and get us to think more expansively about race. We need the legacy of civil rights, and yet at the same time, that legacy is insufficient moving forward into the 21st century. Let me just also say that my parents are culturally Buddhist, so I was not raised in a Christian household. And often when we think about Asian American Christianity, we think Korean because it was one of the first countries to be successfully proselytized by missionaries from the West. And when Korean immigrants came in 1903, they came to work as labor in sugar plantations in Hawaii. So the kind of history of Korean American identity is Christian. But for me, as the son of immigrants from Taiwan, my parents were culturally Buddhist. I converted when I was 11. I think it was due in large part to growing up in the true buckle, the Bible Belt. I had people proselytizing me, and they were white Southern Baptists. It's a story that I won't get into right now, but I will say one of them, Aaron Holloman, he served in Iraqi freedom and he died serving the military. So these are the kind of people that introduced me to Christianity. And while I wouldn't teach these kinds of methods to my students in terms of the way that I would want them to lead worship and preaching, it's how it happened, and it stuck with me, and it's led me to where I am.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, Gerald. The layers, I think the one pronounced thing that keeps coming out of this conversation is the layers, the layers that's brought us here. Not just one of our stories is the same. There are some common thread, but we can all see the different layers in each of our stories. Thank you so much for sharing that, Gerald.
Thank you.
Let's see. Go ahead, Gerald.
Methodist call. I ended up at the Methodist church because my neighbor across the street was a youth minister. And so I started going to the Methodist church at the youth group when I was 12, but that's how I became Methodist. So.
Wow. That's awesome. That's great. So let's see, we have two more on the panel who have not shared. Let's hear from you, Rosa. What are your layers? Everyone's talking about their layers. What are yours?
Hi. Well, thank you, Charisna and Scarrett Bennett for inviting me. And yeah, I've been appreciating listening to all the layers. I think we get used to telling our story in a very 3 sentences. I'm from here and here and
right.
So I kind of appreciate it. Hope I don't go all over the place just from listening to everyone's stories and reflecting. But yeah, my family, my grandparents are from Mexico, a few different states in the northern part of Mexico, and they migrated to the north of Mexico towards the border, of the United States. And for a while, they were crossing and working in the United States, and eventually decided to buy homes in Arizona. So my parents are actually the generation 1.5 because they were both young enough. They were the youngest of their families where they grew up in Mexico, but also went to school in Arizona, which, I didn't even think about till later. When you see your parents, you just see adults. And I'm like, as I started to learn a little bit more about our family history, the language thing is something that I noticed later, that English was a stronger language for them. And I think it's because they came over later, even though in our area, most people are bilingual. But you know, our grandparents mostly, you know, still spoke Spanish. But yeah, and so where I grew up was, I mean, everybody was Mexican. um, you know, there were in my age group, you know, we had like a few Native Americans, which are the Cocopa in my area. We had, I think it was just like one black family, one white family, you know, but those families spoke Spanish and were Spanglish, bilingual. So we were all Mexican. It was, you know, you were just lighter, you were darker, and some of us were in the middle, you know. But yeah, and then as a teenager, my mom moved to Tennessee, so I ended up going to check it out, and I'm still here. That was in 1998. And so, you know, it's like I was in the Southwest, now I'm in the American South, and navigating that with my daughter, you know, like sometimes when we go back and forth, when I'm like, Allie, you're Mexican. She's like, well, I'm from Tennessee. I'm from the South. And I'm like, wait, what? So already some of her layers are also, you know, building there. Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to mention, since many of you mentioned the religion in my town, and I think it's at least what I hear here in the South too, that all Mexicans are Catholic. And yeah, many of the people in my community were Catholic, but there were also other religions. I was actually both of my grandma's favorite. So I had to go to the Catholic church. And then on Sunday, I had to be at the Pentecostal church all day. And the
I
only
love it.
that made it bearable in my mind, I mean, we walked a block from our house to the church, so you know we could kind of get home quick, but was eating there, you know, I was like, well, I know that we're gonna share a great lunch. Which, when you were talking about the soup, I mean, like, I've heard the salad story, but I also like the soup story in the sense that I'm like, I never had a soup that was just mush, right? I'm like, our soup is caldo, and it's like, I want those bones in there. I want the potatoes.
Yes.
I want the veggies. I want to see that bay leaf that I'm like, did they rip that from the, you know, outside? Like to me, all of those flavors, right, in some of that broth is what makes it delicious, right? Yeah, and I mean, for us, food is a thing too. And I love, funny thing, so I live in Clarksville, Tennessee. A few years ago, I, you know, had people at work asking me, Rosa, where do you go eat real Mexican food? And I was like, well, honestly, I go to the Filipino place because they have this caldo, this soup, this broth
Yes.
that is just like ours, but the potato's different, the green is different, but at the end of the day, it's the same family, right? And so I'm like, that's where I go. And I remember, like, people would look at me like, what is she talking about? But I just felt really connected, you know, to that culture here in Clarksville because of food, right? It's like bringing us together. Yeah, it was different being in Tennessee, going from Mexicans to other Spanish speaking brown people. Puerto Ricans were some of the first people that I met, and I'm like, I don't know what a wawa is, which to me that sounds like water in Spanish, but to them it's like a little van, a little right. So yeah, you know, there's been a lot of layers building here in the American South. Yeah, so I think those are just a few of the things that I kind of wanted to mention in my experience.
I love that. I love that, Rosa. Okay, so we'll use the soup analogy as long as it's that kind of soup,
Yes.
okay? Where we can clearly see the potatoes and the chicken legs and the bones and all of that. Okay. In our culture, we call it bouillon. You know, the bouillon is hearty, it's meaty, and I mean, they say if you drink that bouillon, it'll get rid of all kinds of viruses and flus and all of that.
Yeah,
So we'll
believe
use
it.
that. We will use that. Thank you so much for sharing, Rosa. Again, we're just elevating our context, the layers that oftentimes get erased in America. And you said something, Rosa, that you know, being grateful for this time where we don't just share our stories in one or two sentence when someone asks you, so where you're from, you know, and you have to quickly pick one of your layers, right? Okay, I was born, I'm from New Jersey, you know, and I'm like, that's not entirely true, but we'll go with that because I only have 30 seconds. So this context, you know, this conversation gives us an opportunity to just talk about our layers a little bit and talk about, you know, all the different pieces without being too much in a hurry. So last but not least, Jose, we would love to hear a little bit from you and where you're from. We have time, okay?
Thank you. Let me first chime in and say that it's bone in or don't give me anything.
That's right. That's right.
That's where all the flavor is. If you give me something with no bones in it, take it
That's
back.
right.
My name is legal name is Jose Francisco Morales Torres. We take both parents' last names in Puerto Rico, and so hence that name. I say that because through a middle part of my life, I went by Jose Morales and even by the North Americanized Jose Morales Jr., which is interesting because legally, my father and I don't have the same name. He's Jose Francisco Morales Gonzalez, and I'm Jose Francisco Morales Torres. Those are different names to the Puerto Rican, but they lop off the second last name and make you Junior. But part of my own reclaiming of my identity is that I publish and I write and I speak with both last names. So it's probably important for me to actually start not with my birth, but with the birth of my siblings before I came. I'm the youngest. I'm the youngest of five, 4 sisters and me. Even when I was born, I came with another girl into that family. So my mom was always wanting a boy. And when she got the boy, she also got a girl. I'm a twin sister. And but before we were born, my parents were Pentecostal missionaries, and they had spent, after being married, they had spent 13 years in Colombia. So 2 of the first 3 sisters were born in Colombia. One was born in Medellin, and the other one was born in Bogota. If you know Colombia, one will be called a paisa, and the other one will be called a rola. And so when I was born into a Puerto Rican family that had absorbed Colombian culture without losing its own Puerto Rican culture. So we went to Puerto Rico, where I was born, and shortly after being born, being missionaries as they were sent off to Caracas, Venezuela. And I still remember the very first memories of my upbringing were from a country that I have no biological connection to, no historic connection. In the sense, I mean, I was lived there, but I was not Venezolano, and yet my first memories were Venezuelan memories. And so that's important for us because as Puerto Ricans now, you know, and most Caribbeans, we kind of wrestle between this sort of pan-Caribbean identity, but also this very insular, at times parochial, island by island identity. And so we were the type of Puerto Ricans that were, because we had lived in Colombia and Venezuela, we had an awareness of some other that might be like us. They speak Spanish, but they're different from us. And so that was a very interesting way to grow up. I remember talking to Puerto Rican friends and mentioning Colombian food or Venezuelan food, thinking that I was mentioning Puerto Rican food. And the Puerto Ricans would look at me like, what is hallacas? I don't know what hallacas are. And I had to explain to them. And I said, but you don't know hallacas? And my mom had to say, they don't know what hallacas are. You do. So very early on, somewhat of a Pan-American upbringing, if you will. Um, because my parents were kind of pastor missionaries, they kind of went where the work did. I don't know. So I moved to the United States around 4 or 5, between 4 and 6. I always say 5, but I'm not exactly sure the exact age. And I can't say there was economic disadvantages or what have you. I think church world is a little different. A church opens up, they want your father or your mother, and you go. And so we ended up in Lorain, Ohio, which in the 80s was the largest Puerto Rican diaspora between Chicago and New York, because there was a steel plant and there was a Ford plant there in Lorain. Interestingly, the house we found was not in the Puerto Rican neighborhood. Or to be more exact, it was a Puerto Rican ghetto. We actually lived with poor white kids and upwardly mobile, low middle class white families. So we did that for 6 years. But there's a story that's important for me. About 1.5 years into living in predominantly white school, had some traumatic experiences because the school in that district did not have bilingual education. So we were failing horribly. And then finally we had to go out of district to a school that had bilingual education. But I remember about 1.5 years into moving, my dad said something like, "You're losing your Spanish." And I remember screaming out, "I hate speaking Spanish." Now, I'm trying to rack my brain around the time when a racist group of young kids came around holding banners saying Spanish is ugly, or any sort of really openly racist expressions against Spanish culture, Spanish speaking, Puerto Rican culture. And there isn't one. And so a few years later, when I look back upon that moment when I said I hate speaking Spanish, I realized just how insidious race is.
Mm.
My neighbors were good to me. I mean, they weren't bad. They weren't calling me epitaphs and weren't doing any of that. And yet it was so much part of that culture that within a matter of 1 year, 1.5 years, I'm able to scream out of guttural response, "I hate speaking Spanish." With that said, later in life, I reclaimed my Spanish. So I write, I teach, I read in Spanish. I reclaim my full Spanish name. People don't have to say Jose, but I say Jose. If you have to say Jose or whatever form, that's fine by me. But there's some things that I've done to reclaim that. The other thing that might be interesting for at least Gerald, who teaches worship, is that even though I became English dominant fairly early, my spirituality was Spanish dominant. Mm-hmm. So I didn't read an English Bible until I was 19 years old, even though I was English dominant by the time I was 6 or 7. And so all the Psalms to this day mean nothing to me in the English language. In the King James, I don't care. In Spanish, I hear the voice of angels every time I hear these Psalms being read. So that's an important piece for me. Now, the most significant turn was when we were supposed to move to California and somehow ended up stuck in Chicago for 21 years. And so many times I identify as a Chicagoan. And I left Chicago for about 10 years and I'm back, and I couldn't be happier to come back home for me. And one thing I like to say is, my blood is from Puerto Rico, but my heart is Chicago. So for me, Chicago is my upbringing. And in Chicago, again, there is a Puerto Rican neighborhood, but we've never lived in that Puerto Rican neighborhood. We lived in a neighborhood with a lot of Mexican and Mexican American and a lot of African Americans, with a smaller group of Ethiopians, Central Americans, Haitians. And so for me, I grew up in that sort of mix. I went to a predominantly African American school. And again, it's for Latino, Latina, to enter into, at least in what I say east of Mississippi, the strong binary between Black and white, it complicates how one tries to seek out one's own identity.
Yeah.
There is a colorism issue in Puerto Rico. I've named it. Whenever I teach classes on Latinx studies and religion, we take at least one session, if not 3-4 sessions, on Latinx anti-Blackness. We have to address that. And yet, one thing that I am clear, that it wasn't until I moved to the United States that I was in a very real way racialized. Prior to this, I was a culture among cultures. And we understood growing up as a kid that our culture, I have Black cousins, I have redhead, freckled white cousins, everything in between. And that came first over sort of skin tone. Again, is there colorism? You bet there is. Is there this latent anti-blackness? Of course. Anybody who's colonized by some European power will have some latent anti-black.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yet, race was never a primary indicator growing up in a Puerto Rican environment. Culture was. That we got along more with our own Puerto Ricans, whatever the shades were, than with other cultures, even cultures that looked like us, but they were different. So for me, I think growing up, where language, language was both, has been and is my way of kind of owning to this sort of dual belonging that's continually contested. I get asked all the time, where are you from? And I, being a smart blank, I'll say, I'm from Chicago. And I know, where are you really from? The South side of Chicago. So, I give them the runaround. And yet right. I go to Puerto Rico. And recently we went to Puerto Rico, and this really upset my wife. We were at a kiosk, because the best food comes from a kiosk, not from the restaurants. We order on the side of the road. And mid-ordering, and the lady said, "You're not from here." Mid-sentence, I wasn't even done ordering my empanadas, and "You're not from here." And that really it probably upset my spouse more than it upset me, but it was upsetting because I'm actually born in Puerto Rico.
Wow.
This sort of constantly dual belonging, yet belonging nowhere, has always been this contested piece for me. And I'll end by saying, a few years ago, I graduated from McCormick for my MDiv. We did an Asian American and Latino-Latina exchange, figuring out that there might be some connections here that we are unexplored. And I was asked to preach at one point, and I just chose the text, "How do we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" And it was one of the hardest sermons I had to put together, because everything felt foreign. Chicago, that I own, that I say it's me, Puerto Rico. And so where do I sing is where that sermon took me. And eventually we had to say, sing anyway. We sing anyway. And so for me, I think constantly negotiating identity has become something that's a journey for me, an existential and a spiritual one. And along the way, I sing as often as I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jose. I think this might be a good way to segue into some of these challenges for us as, whether we're first generation or 1.5ers. I think many of us can identify with the 1.5 here on the panel. I think a good way to segue is to talk about what you just talked towards the end of you sharing the challenges. I think for me, there's trauma all around, whether it be trauma that's bringing us here or trauma being here. Not everyone has, the trauma of coming here, but there's definitely challenges, in being here, challenges with identity, challenges with belonging. I'm a counselor. And so part of the work that I do is identity work, and helping people come to a greater understanding of their identity and how to live that out, And so one question that the panel can respond to or even reflect on are some of the challenges we've endured in this sense of identity, or reclaiming or claiming our identity, or waking up to this dual belonging that you talked about. Where are you guys with that? Where have you been with it, and where are you right now with just challenges in your identity in this very moment of your life? And we can go with the same order, or we can start with Niji, and we can go back. We can go through the same order.
Yeah, thank you, Dula. I think for me, my experience was it's a pendulum, right? As soon as you arrive here, America is the newest thing, and you want to adapt as much as possible. And in fact, you shun your culture so much that you don't want to be around the people around you, and eventually you become what it's to be an American. You wear the mask, you speak the language the way that you do, you wear the clothes, you eat the food, and being able to adapt as much as possible. But over time, as you get older, you realize that's not who you are. And then eventually figuring out there is holes in the theory of accepting it wholeheartedly, what it means to be an American. And then eventually a process that goes to the other side, which is relearning what it means to be an Indian, relearning what it means to celebrate the holidays, relearning, for example, for me, it took years to get there, but I love going to a wedding and wearing a traditional Indian attire but that's part of me as well. And I can relate to Jose a lot, because when you go to India, they have not seen bald people. That's the first challenge. And so most of the Indians have hair in India. So I stand out very clearly. And so it's very clear that I don't belong there. And so with my language, trying to convince them, it's very clear. And so I could relate to that. So it's a dance of the pendulum of going, and I don't think you can expedite that process. I think it's every individual has to go through that process. And now being able to go to the other side and accepting both is the well-balanced approach, is being able to say, I am truly Indian, I am truly American as well. And it is unique to me, and I'm proud of it. And I don't need to hide it. I don't want to. That's a layer that shows out proudly and not being hidden in that way. And so we started celebrating holidays. We started celebrating that. Those are things that I pass down to my kids. We go to India as much as often as we can, because that's part of our culture. And being able to enjoy and speaking language, eating the food, and enjoying that cultural aspect of it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I can resonate with the rejection piece, rejecting our culture because we are in this plurality, we're in this dominant culture. I remember I used to hate speaking with an accent. I used to hate people mentioning that, oh, you speak with an accent. What are you? I used to hate all those different nuances of myself. I think right now for me, I'm in between like grief. I feel like I'm constantly grieving what's been lost through the process of assimilation. And even in the Haitian culture, there's so much lost through colonization, because we don't even know, what our people, how they celebrated God, how they experienced the world. We don't even know, because so much of that is lost, so a part of me is grieving still. I think I'm coming to a greater understanding of who I am and embracing that duality. But there's so much grief there still, for not knowing fully and not knowing how to do that dance fully from day to day. And Tasha, why don't you share a little bit about you, where you are with that? I love what you said, Niji, the pendulum. Where are you with that, of just your identity process and waking up to that?
I think for me, my experience has been honestly and unfortunately pretty much absorbing whatever identity has been attached to me in the particular context that I was in. And so I came, when I came to the United States and in Brooklyn, the experience that my older sisters had, I'm the youngest of the 7, and my older sisters were teenagers. They went to a high school that had a significant Panamanian population, so they were able to retain that. I did not, and so I hung out with the Caribbeans. And by the time I was a young adult, when they were young adult, they were socializing and partying and going to places that were Panamanian and Latino. By the time I was a young adult, I was socializing and hanging out with the Caribbeans and going to the, you know, the reggae and the Caribbean clubs. And so that was my identity. But when I went off to college, I went to St. Bonaventure University, who's very, very white Franciscan University, upstate New York, with a very tiny minority population. So I became Black then. There was no nuance. You were either white or Black. And so I was just Black. I was a Black girl. I was the president of the Black Student Union. You know, I was Black. And then I moved to Kansas. Not a lot. Well, there was a dearth of Latino people there, and then I converted. I became Pentecostal, and so my life was consumed by, you know, a very austere Pentecostal existence. So that drew me really far away from my culture, because I wasn't listening to the music, or, you know, you just abandon the culture really in this kind of, you know, bubble. But it also was the time that I was the most Latina, because I got a job as a coordinator for Latin American services for a company where I was doing translations and talking to, you know, people in Mexico and Colombia. And so I was fully engaged in my linguistic and cultural kind of knowledge, but that's when I had children, and my children don't know any of the language. I didn't pass on a lot of the culture because I was overly concerned about how my children would be pigeonholed if I taught them the language. You know, I had a friend who was Panamanian, and she taught her child Spanish at home, and they stuck her kid in ESL classes, and she spent years arguing with the school system about pulling him out. Even though he was bilingual, they just stuck him there because they ask you one thing: what's the primary language you speak at home? And you say Spanish, and they automatically stick them in ESL. And we know that those classes are not the greatest. So I was overly concerned about that. So I didn't pass on the language to my children. I was concerned about them being successful and not being railroaded. So there's a certain amount of grieving about that. And what was lost, and what I haven't passed on, and what I won't be able to pass on, and what can I pass on at this point. So it's a work in progress. And I think Nijik said it's a pendulum. It moves. I aspire to get to Jose's level where I can reclaim all these things. I don't know, but I'm reclaiming some of it. Like, you know, Chusak and not
That's
Chusak.
right. There you go. Baby steps. Okay. Baby steps in reclaiming. Right on. Gerald, how about you? Why don't you lean in on this conversation and share a little bit about just some of the challenges and where you are on that pendulum?
Yeah, so many thoughts are going through my head. I mean, for me personally, not only being a convert to Christianity, but then pursuing ordination, becoming a theological educator. For my parents, there's no point of reference for them, you know, because they're culturally Buddhist. And the key adjective there is culturally, meaning they're similar to someone who's culturally Catholic or culturally Jewish. They weren't observant, you know what I mean? So religion was more or less kind of if you go to a Buddhist temple in Taiwan, it's kind of like a gas station. You go in and maybe throw down some prayer sticks and say a quick prayer and then leave. It's not like there's a assembly or a worship service happening. It's just kind of in the air, and it's not functioning like a community center as a Buddhist temple might on the West Coast or here in New York where I live or something like this. So for them to see their son kind of convert to Christianity, and then not only that, but pursue it professionally. My whole life is anchored in this calling. I think it's been a shock, to say the least. When I used to be a pastor in England, and when my parents visited me, and I could probably count the number of times they've been to church on like this hand, and it's either been because I was baptized or I was the pastor, you know. But my mother would heckle me. She'd say, well, if you're visiting people in the hospital this much, why don't you just go to medical school? Or, you know, you're spending 3 years to do an MDiv, just get your MBA, or 6 years to get a PhD. You could, you know, be a real doctor or something like this. So I think just a part of it is not only this kind of grieving or figuring out how to interweave these different identities, but there's a real pull to invent what it means to be American, and specifically to be an American Christian. If I say preacher to a class that I'm teaching, for example, and ask them to close their eyes and imagine who that is, they're definitely not imagining me. They may not even be imagining themselves. And so there's a lot of work to kind of undo that theological imagination, and it requires a certain invention, because as someone born in Jackson, Mississippi, the assimilation critique only works to a certain extent, because what am I assimilating to if I was born in Mississippi? It's only because I look a certain way that I'm expected to perform my ethnicity, right? Or that people would think, oh, Mandarin must be his first language. But this actually doesn't make logical sense given my own story, my background. I see a question from Charisma that she posted. How do people ask, you know, about your story if they sense something without sounding insensitive and saying where you're from? I think one tip I would give is just not to lead with that question. Or to say a disclaimer. You know, I don't know how to word this, but I'm curious about your story. I think just being upfront about our own curiosities or our own ignorance makes it a lot easier to talk about our differences. So for me professionally, I think this is the way in which I've tried to really sharpen how I think about breaking open the black and white binary, and also trying to define what it means to be Asian American and also an Asian American Christian, because it still is a frontier in many ways. Again, if I say Asian American Christianity, we automatically think Korean for the most part in the Methodist Church, not some kid who was born in Jackson, Mississippi to immigrants from Taiwan. You know, there's no, or if we think about Asian American identity in general, we're thinking bi-coastal. It must be the West Coast, or it must be New York, maybe Chicago. This idea of someone being from the South is not on the table at all. So there's a lot of kind of making it up as I go along. And I feel a kind of freedom to that. But what I also want to say is we often think of these conversations as needing to be resolved in terms of the way that we approach them. And that there's a strong way of doing that. I mean, just hearing all of you speak, and Jose about moving from I hate Spanish to now teaching and writing in Spanish. But that personal responsibility, I think, is also a kind of trauma, because what we're dealing with is systemic prejudice. This is why I began with the first immigration ban being the Chinese Exclusion Act, or, you know, with histories like knowing that McKinley was a Methodist president. And after the Spanish-American War, he also had acquired the Philippines, an Asian country that was Spanish speaking, right? And he didn't know what to do with them. He's recorded in the Methodist Advocate, I think it was, which was one of the largest circulating weeklies in the country. It's not just a church newspaper, that God told him to go and Christianize the Philippines. Well, they were already Christians.
Right.
Already Catholics. But what it ended up becoming was a kind of experiment for the US to become an empire without explicitly participating in imperialism, because we ended up practicing colonialism through the exportation of religious freedom. So what did we do? We replaced all the European priests with Filipino ones. In the southern islands, they were Muslim. We said that the Sultan could remain in power as long as he didn't practice slavery anymore. But this was a type of exporting democratic ideals that were mostly driven by a kind of white Protestant hegemony that was actually shrouding a way of the US practicing becoming a superpower. You know, so anyway, that may sound technical. All I'm trying to say is when you have that kind of background where things like that are happening, or a country that begins with the depopulation of indigenous peoples, that built its infrastructure from slavery. Princeton Seminary, the first three founding professors all spoke against slavery passionately. They all had slaves. Hodge, in the very next sentence in some of his writing, is speaking just as vehemently against abolition. When you have that as your root, it's a misconception simply to ask people to reframe how they think or change themselves from the inside. So how does Gerald become a nation American? Well, I sort of do this in my own work. Yes, I have to do that, but we also have to realize the conditions, the very environment, the ecology is actually the huge problem. And so I think it's a and I'll stop here, but it's a misrecognition to place so much responsibility on agency, even though that is a powerful way of defining who we are, especially in terms of the multiplicities that influence our identity and the things that we believe. But so anyway, that was a kind of long answer.
No, it's so good, Gerald. You know, I love what you said about this is still a big frontier, you know, for us to overcome. And as we're trying to navigate identity and agency and who we are and all these big and nuanced things, this is a challenge, you know, and it's grieving. There's a lot of grief in that. And so thank you so much for sharing. I feel like we can spend so much time just teasing out and pulling back the layers. But I love how you put the onus back on, you know, the empire, you know, they
collective effort, you know, to say that the individual actors bear the main responsibility, I think is a real misconception of what the problem actually is.
Yeah. So we'll sit here and talk more and about this, and because it's so good, it's so necessary. I would love to hear from some of the other panelists about this. Rosa, tell us a little bit of where you are with this.
Well, I'm taking notes from
That's right. That's right.
Is saying, because you know, I think, at least for myself, we don't always have these conversations with ourselves, right? Like we just experience, and it is, and until it comes up, and you know, you remember things, they're part of you, but we don't sit there and break it down. So literally taking notes, I'm like, I gotta go back to this part, you know. But yeah, I mean, you know, I'm just kind of like remembering, I think most of us have talked about the accent, right, and language, and I'm just like thinking back, where I grew up is like 5 miles from the Mexican border, so our foot was in both worlds. You know, it was just like back in the day when it wasn't such a struggle to cross back and forth, and you know, we had family members that still lived in Mexico, did grocery shopping, went to parties, funerals, everything. But you know, I remember that when I would, you know, speak in Spanish, that same, it's like, oh, you know, you're from the other side, and I'm sitting here like, we're both eating tacos. What do you mean? Like we're the same culture, we're the same community. And then, you know, I come to Tennessee and I begin to work in this little town called Wartrace, Tennessee. I was like the first, I guess, not Black person, not white person to work there. So, you know, people already looked at me strange, but during our break, when we would sit there and chat, and, you know, people would say to me, and this, you know, they'd be like, oh, where's your accent from? And I'm like, excuse me? I have an accent? You know, when I'm like trying to understand the Southern accent, right? And all like the vocabulary that comes with it. And I just remember it like blowing my mind that I could also have an accent. You know, and then just thinking about something Tasha said, that, you know, maybe we don't even think about it, but that we just kind of blend in, right? I mean, we already know what we look like, and that we don't always fit into the groups that we're in or are where we work. And so I just think that I imagine that automatically I'm always just kind of assimilating, probably trying to make, my vocabulary, my accent as like dull as possible. And yeah, when I go home to Arizona, which I mostly have done every year since I left, I'm like, yes, I get to speak Spanglish. I get to like jack up words and, whatever words we make up and the language, like I get to like be normal. And I think when you're in it, you don't always remember until you're back where you feel safe. Which is funny, where I feel safe because now when I go home, family members are like, Rosa, you speak like you're from the South. And I'm like, oh no. So it's just, I guess that constant juggling. And I guess I would say for me is like, I'm mostly fine with it. I guess it just comes with time when you're like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. But then also, I guess same as to what, Jose has said, is reclaiming some of it as much as we can here or wherever we're at, right? And trying to create a culture. And going back to food, it's like for me now that I'm in the South, okay, Christmas means tamales and chicken and dressing. I'm fine with that. I love chicken and dressing. Like I'm okay with like the blending of all of these different things, right? Yeah, so just learning to be okay, because at the end of the day, it's like the people, right? And that we're gonna spend time with community that we know we want to be in. Or at least that's what I'm trying.
Dila, before
Yeah.
can I just want to add
Yes,
like one
go
quick
ahead.
thought. Something that Jose said earlier was about his sermon, and that how everything feels foreign, that sense of belonging. And I've had a similar experience, and I wonder if it's I think, Gerald, I don't know where you are now. You're in New York, I think you said, but the movement, right? So Panamanian from Panama to New York City, to upstate New York, to Kansas, to Tennessee now. And there's so much adaptation that's happening. And I have the same feeling sometimes. Last time I spent the most amount of time in New York was for my mother's passing 2 years ago. And I'm driving around in neighborhoods that I don't recognize anymore. And I had this kind of really sad feeling like I don't belong anywhere anymore, because I don't recognize New York. I haven't been in Kansas in so many years. The friends that I had in Kansas, those friendship bonds are starting to kind of thin out. I'm in Tennessee, but I've been in Tennessee for about 7 years, but it still doesn't feel like home. When I'm here, some people recognize my accent as being East Coast. Sometimes if I'm in New York, different places, different people pick up either the Spanish in my accent or the Caribbean in my accent, or and when I go home, my family rags me about sounding like I'm Southern. I don't sound Panamanian anymore. And you just feel like, where exactly do I belong? You just feel kind of out of place, somehow out of place in every place.
Yeah. It's that feeling of loss, that feeling of not belonging. And I think there's a core tenet to every human being is to belong, right? We want to belong. And I think there's that grief and tension, that loss feeling for many immigrants or many people whose stories did not necessarily originate here. There's that feeling of loss, of not belonging here or there, and you feel it every day, by the different questions that's asked, or having to defend almost why you belong in certain places. Jose, since you got us started on this this segment of feeling not belonging fully or reclaiming identity, what more would you like to add on this this part of it?
Sure, and I'll try to be brief, though. When professors say that,
Yes.
usually end up not being brief. And I actually, as a way to answer or contribute a little more, I actually want to address that audience question in the sense of, is there a respectful way? And I want to first echo what I can't remember exactly who said it, but this idea of check who it is and you shouldn't lead with that. That's all true. And this is going to be hard to hear, but I'll just lay it out here. I think you should be content with whatever answer we give you. So if I say I'm from the south side of Chicago, that's what I'm telling you.
Right.
That's the part of me that I want to share with you at this time. I'm not going to tell you about how I got this belly from eating Colombian arepas and arroz y gandules and taking la guagua, which is the bus. I'm going to tell you I'm Chicagoan, and that's hard. And trust me, it's hard for me. I mean, because my Latinx radar is pretty good. I can see somebody who's very, very light skinned or somebody who's very dark and be like, they're not African American or they're not white. And I'd be like, ¿Cómo está papá? And immediately it's like, oh, hey, how you doing? I'm from Cuba. I'm from here. Like, so, but if they say, look, I'm from Miami or I'm from New York or I'm from Kansas, I'm from Mississippi, my curiosity wants to know from Gerald, oh, yeah, but you're Asian. But Gerald already told me where he's from. Be content with that answer. If Gerald wants to say he's a Mississippian, is that how I say it right? Then Gerald's, because part of it, by reinforcing this set of questions, you're reinforcing this sense of exclusion that Gerald can't be from Mississippi, that
Right.
Jose can't just say he's from Chicago. Be content with whatever side of us we want to show you and we want to share with you. Be content with that. And it bugs me. Trust me. I'm like, I want to know where people are from. But if they tell me they're from Crown Heights it is. That's it. The other thing I will say in terms of negotiating identity and not feeling left out. So, and this is going to be actually kind of grim, but it's been proving rather liberating for me. The existentialist philosophers, Miguel de Unamuno, and existentialists tend to be bleak anyway, so you're going to get bleak here. He wrote a book called Tragic Sense of Life, El Sentimento Trágico de la Vida. And in it, he says that we lie to ourselves when we tell ourselves that we live epic to epic, that we sort of live success to success. And he said, actually, we live tragedy to tragedy. That's where he gets the tragic sense of life. And what he means to say is that even when we choose between two options, when we choose the better option, when we choose good over bad, even when we do that, something dies in our decision. Something dies. There's a death that happens. Now, this sounds horrible. Of course it is. And yet it is also freeing, in the sense that maybe this is why it didn't bother me that much that somebody said, you're not from here in Puerto Rico, because I had become very familiar to that slice of death in my own identity. I had owned it, said, this is who I am. I've made my choice. And so this sense of owning the tragic in our life, in our spiritual life, in our identity formation, that it's ongoing, it's this journey. And many times in that journey, you will be without a home. I mean, that's just the way it is. If you own it up front and say, this is that tragic element of life, you actually find not just freedom, but even joy. And joy to be able to say, I'm Chicagoan, and I don't have to wear my Puerto Rican flag on my sleeve. It's in my heart. I don't have to wear it on my sleeve, and I don't have to convince others that it's there. I've freed myself from the fact that in every choice I've made in my life, there's been tragedy.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I think that there's that sort of owning the tragic in all this that actually can be very, very freeing, and can bring greater joy. That's what I would add.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I think the last part, the final stage, in the stages of grief is usually acceptance. Accepting, the tragic as you share. I think for me, some days I'm better at accepting than other days. You know, there are some moments where, you know, I'm fully on board. I'm like, okay, all that has been lost, let me count all of the ways that I'm grieving today, and I'm okay with that. I find victory. There are some days I'm in fetal position with just the pain and the sheer tragedies that's happened in all of our stories and our context, and in the United States, the immigrant story, the colonization stories, the story of trauma, of all of our context. So some days I'm better at it, some days I'm not. Some days I'm claiming, you know, my full identity, my name, and you know, and we'll go to Haiti and celebrate and do different things and celebrate. You know, there are some days I'm better at it than others. I think as a last question, I would love to know what's one thing that you are reclaiming or claiming right now, currently, presently, in about you, like at today, July 19th, 2020. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but today, what are you embracing or owning or accepting about your story, like Jose shared? Any takers? Anyone can chime in.
I'll take it. Just a quick response. I recognize the importance of cooking. I think just from generation to generation, we have the convenience. What spoils us in the U.S. is we have the convenience and multitude options of food. But being able to cook like my mom does, being able to cook like my dad does, and being able to have those recipes and model those and being able to taste those, I think those are all ways for me to get to who I am truly. So that's something that I want to pass down to my
That's
kids as
awesome.
well. So just being able to enjoy cooking.
And let me tell you, Niji cooks, you guys. He cooks, okay? Not just cook with a little c, with capital C, and it's good. Anyone else want to chime in?
I'll follow up just because I think food is so powerful. And I was going to say that in addition to the tragic, I mean, because of my own Christian faith, I not only accept the tragic, I also accept that resurrection is possible. And for me, Spanish became resurrected in my life. My Puerto Rican identity, I married a thoroughly Puerto Rican wife who was born and raised and got her first college degree in Puerto Rico. So their resurrections are possible. And yet resurrections, Christ doesn't get recognized quickly post-resurrection. There's something that's changed. It's not the same, it's not resuscitation, but it's a resurrection into some form of new life. So for me, that's sort of expecting the resurrection. And again, I'm an ordained minister too, with the tradition that does weekly communion. In one of those gospel stories, Jesus is recognized at the table. And so for me, it's this sort of resurrecting these identities around a plate of arroz con gandules or arroz con habichuelas, and or some good asopao, that there's something there, and in eating together and in sharing with your kids, this is the food that I grew up in. That's, I think, that's something I'm reclaiming.
That's awesome. Anyone else would like to chime in?
Just want to quickly say that, I mean, I wouldn't say that this is recent, but it's something that I'm always trying to turn over. And that is that our histories are always in motion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I'm thinking of Revelation 7:9, where all nations, people, and tribes, languages are before the Lamb. I mean, Jesus is not even a person at this point, right? And if we think of the invitation as some sort of broad wedding banquet, I mean, this is a marriage unlike any we've ever seen, if you think of how many people are involved. How this works out on the ground, I would say, for example, in Taiwan, they elected their first female president recently. They were the first Asian country, I believe, to legalize same-sex marriage. These are things that my parents would not necessarily be down with. And so it's important for us, I think, to understand that cultures are always contested. They can be exploited, but they're also implicated in things that are transgressive. they can be romanticized, and some of that romanticization is deserved, but things move on.
Mhm.
It's always in motion, and this is why I, also and I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of grief, lament, negotiation that's difficult and heart wrenching, and at the same time, there's a real opportunity
Mhm.
to kind of create something new, and this is what I'm trying to double down on, is to thinking, well, what is this future of trying to understand what it means to be Asian American or to be Christian, or to think with my African American, Latinx, indigenous brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. I mean, even beyond sexuality and gender, So there's, I just don't want us to forget that kind of frontier space either.
That's good. That's wonderful. Any others want to chime in?
I'll just like to say that I think that the thing that I embrace the most is that I am not just bilingual, not just bicultural. I have a multicultural existence, and that has influenced my every aspect of my life, my outlook in life, my perspective, my ability to think critically is because I was very early exposed to many different cultures and all the goodness and the complexity that comes with it. And even for me in my own personal development, when I moved away from Pentecostalism, one of the things that was critical for me in that time was the need to let go of the binary. Things are not just good or bad, good and evil. The binary will keep you stuck. Life is complex, people are complex, issues are nuanced, and they're varied, and you have to take the time and the energy to examine and to investigate and to experience all of those things. And that is the thing that I feel like is the vibrancy that to my life, right? And embracing the idea that I am a daughter of immigrants who became an immigrant. Like when I sit and think about that, that my people were just establishing a new life and a new place from a place that they were taken to. Because when I'm talking about immigrants to Panama from Jamaica, we're talking about enslaved people who were taken from their land to Jamaica to then to migrate to another land, to then migrate to another land. I don't care what people say, that's some bomb-ish. That's a lot of adaptation, that's a lot of endurance, that's a lot of ingenuity. My grandfather he worked for the Canal Zone. He couldn't take the oppression. He became an entrepreneur. He owned racehorses. My uncle was the trainer. My dad was the co-owner. These were people who were determined and resilient and forever pushing. And I am determined into reclaiming our immigrant story for my children, and making sure that that's not lost.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Tasha. Rosa, any final word from you?
Well, I don't want to be the final word, but
Yeah.
thinking, definitely about, our history and our ancestors. I think I'm at that age too where I'm like, what am I letting my daughter reclaim? Like trying to stay open, and remembering that, she's forming her own layers right now, because I think it's like, as much as I say I want tamales with chicken and dressing, this morning, I had made chilaquiles, which is just like a Mexican breakfast. And what did she eat? Cereal. And you want to be like upset about something that's simple, where you're like, you have a good Mexican breakfast, home cooked, salsa, and you eat cereal. But just kind of letting things like that go, right? Like that's simple, but knowing like I just gotta keep being me, keep bringing the culture here into the home. And it's like, she's gonna take whatever she's gonna take, and you know, so I guess I'm feeling like where I'm becoming like that old person that's like, you know, hating on the young people, like you young people don't know what good is or this and that, knowing fully well this is the first time in quarantine that I've learned how to make salsa myself, you know, and yes, for real, I'm not a cook. And so I'm like, yeah, who knows what my grandparents were saying about me, right? But here I am, and with all my layers and complexities. So just letting my daughter be, and not just her, it's like, I mean, I think specifically too, you know, of like her Mexican cousins, and it's like they're figuring out what their culture is here as Mexicans in the South, right? So yeah, just trying to continue to like stay open and not judge the younger people coming up behind me.
Yeah, that's good. I love what you shared about your daughter, and even she is reclaiming and evolving in her understanding of her cultural upbringing as well. Our children, lately, our boys, we have 3 boys. Our oldest is 21 and the twins are 19. And lately they've been ragging on us because we gave them typical American names, they said. And they said, Mom, what happened? Why did you not give us typical Haitian names? You know, our oldest, you gave, you know, a name that connects him to our dad and the culture, and us, you gave us Justin and Devin. Do you know how many white people have these names, Mom? And so they've been ragging on me. But there's something to what they're sharing, and I think they're demanding, or they're asking to be a part of something that's greater than them. You know, I think that's what I hear under their, I hear some lament for them too, you know, just as we're talking about grief and loss and all of that. I think our children too are beginning to grieve, and I think it's okay for them to grieve. It's okay for them to see us grieving what's been lost in our cultures, but it's also okay for them to see that we celebrate our cultures as well. We celebrate who we are. We celebrate every part. And I love what you said, Rosa, that sometimes it's okay to just give them the freedom to figure it out. You know, figure out, you know, what this is going to look like for them. So thank you all for sharing. We will be back next week. I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Charisna. Thank you for having us on this panel. And next week, we will come back for part 2.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for such an amazing conversation. We were intentional in planning this conversation to not start with white supremacy, right? That is a form of resistance in many ways, to not or to decenter whiteness in our stories. I think part of this conversation very much is our stories. And last weekend, my sister drove all the way from Georgia with her family to Tennessee to spend some time with me. And what she brought that I was so grateful for was lalo. Lalo is a traditional Haitian dish. And all week I was able, in my own solitary, you know, I'm home by myself quarantining, but the food made me be in community. I felt like I was with my people. That's the power, right, of our food. I think when we are in these native lands or these foreign lands, food allows for us to reconnect with our food. So I appreciate the comments around the food. Thank you all again for joining us. Next week, we will dive deep into white supremacy, racism, and the ways in which it affects us through a multicultural lens. So I invite you to come back next week to join this wonderful panel. They'll be here again as we dive deeper into this conversation, racism, a multicultural lens. Again, thank you all, panelists. You guys were amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all next week. God bless you. Bye-bye.